Okay, I think we'll get started. Hi, welcome. Good evening. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Emily Riley. I'm the Director of Public Engagement at BGC, and I am delighted to welcome you to today's program. Um, I am a white woman with curly auburn hair. I'm wearing a white shirt, and I'm sitting in my living room right now. I'm beside a window, and behind me, you can probably vaguely see some plants. I'd like to start by acknowledging the land that we're hosting this event from. I say this acknowledgement aware that these kinds of statements can be misused as stand-ins for actual decolonization work, which is something for all of us to bear in mind as we go forward in our ongoing commitment to accountability, reparation, and equity. Many cities and institutions in America were founded on the exclusion, harm, and erasures of many indigenous peoples, including those on whose land, Mannahatta, from which we are hosting this event. The land of the 5 boroughs that make up New York City is the unceded territory of the Lenape, Merrick, Canarsie, Matinecock, and Rockaway nations. Despite systemic erasures, these lands persist as intertribal trade lands under the stewardship of many nations and over 115,000 intertribal, Native American, First Nations, and Indigenous people who currently call New York City home. If you'd like to learn more about the land that you are on, if you are tuning in today from somewhere in the United States and beyond, you can click on the link that will be posted in the chat shortly. In addition, I'd like to acknowledge those whose ancestors did not arrive on these lands of their own free will and whose tremendous cultural, economic, and technological contributions continue to provide the foundations for our lives. Thank you for being here. A couple of housekeeping things. We are joined today by Pro Bono ASL, their fabulous team, and they're providing American Sign Language interpretation for this event tonight. If you'd like to turn on closed captioning, you can do so at the bottom of your screen. There'll be a little button that says CC, and you can hide or show those captions. This event will be recorded. We will be editing the captions and then we'll post to YouTube in a couple of weeks on the BGC YouTube page. We invite you to submit questions throughout the program as they come up for you. You can do that using the Q&A function. We're going to use the chat for appreciations and saying hi, but we're going to accept questions through the Q&A. And finally, this is the second in a series of events that we have organized in conjunction with Majolica Mania, an exhibition that is at BGC in New York City. Upcoming, we have an event next week called Beautiful and Deadly, The Dark Side of Pigment. The week after that, or a couple weeks after that, Histories of Lead Activism in America, and a Majolica poetry reading with some luminaries who we commissioned to write some pieces in response to some of the Majolica pieces in our exhibition. And we'll also throw a bunch of links in the chat now where you can learn more about the catalog, the digital exhibition, and if you want to come visit us in person, some timed entry ticket links as well. I'm really thrilled to introduce our 3 conversationalists for tonight. Adrienne L. Childs is an art historian and a curator. She is adjunct curator at the Phillips Collection and associate of the W.E.B. Du Bois Research Institute at the Hitchens Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University. Sequoia Miller is a historian, curator, and studio potter. He is the chief curator and deputy director of the Gardiner Museum in Toronto. And Iris Moon is the assistant curator of European ceramics and glass at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. They all have many more accomplishments than I just articulated. So if you want to read their full bios, we will post a link for that in the chat as well. So without further ado, I'm going to hand the proverbial mic over to Adrienne. You'll see me again at the end when we have a little bit of time for questions, and I'll moderate that section. But thank you for being here. Adrienne, over to you.
Oh, thank you very much, Emily. And I want to also thank you, Emily Riley, and thank you, Nadia Rivers, for inviting me and for inviting all 3 of us, and for helping us to start digging into some of the interesting aspects of that really fascinating exhibition, Majolica Mania. I'm going to share my screen now. And I thank you for inviting us to have this conversation about how race figures into the wonderful world of Victorian Majolica, or what we've called the Majolica imaginary. This speaks to the wide variety of imaginative designs and forms that we find in 19th century Majolica from both England, the continent, and America. Today, we're going to just begin to have a very kind of casual discussion on how notions of race inform ceramics in general and Majolica designs in particular. We hope to tease out what might um, tell us, what these things might tell us about common perceptions of difference and the ways in which ceramic wares embody, normalize, and circulate these notions. Many of the objects that we're going to discuss are actually not in the exhibition, but many were actually in the fantastic and expansive book that accompanies the exhibition. And I do want to warn you that there are some potentially sort of offensive images that we might be looking at, but I think it's important to sort of open our eyes to the way that the racialized ceramics have circulated in the past. So first, our wonderful panelists, we're all going to talk to you just briefly about our own work in this area, so to give you an orientation as to what we've been doing, what we've been thinking about race in decorative arts. And I'm going to start with my work on ornamental Blackness. It's a term that I developed to describe the Black body in European decorative arts. My inquiry into these objects attempts to develop a critical language and map out a strategy for interpreting a brand of luxury objects in which the vogue for representing the African body disseminates tropes of Blackness throughout spaces of wealth and refinement in Europe and beyond. Objects such as porcelains, clocks, furniture, represented not only the taste for the fantasy of the exotic, but also a manifestation of the Black laboring body in the guise of fashion and decor. My work investigates the tensions inherent in this system in which actual Black bodies are enslaved, reviled, feared, subjugated on the one hand, and the symbol of luxury and opulence on the other. So I'm looking at the tensions between in those very odd juxtapositions of ideas. And I want to welcome and throw it over to my colleague and friend Iris Moon, who's going to tell you a little bit about her work in chinoiserie and beyond. Iris?
Thank you so much, Adrienne. I just have to say how important your scholarship has been to thinking about a lot of these issues. You're such a pioneer in that area, and I really appreciate you inviting me to participate in the conversation. So what you're looking at here is a pretty sizable piece of porcelain of four figures, a man, two women, and a child, and it's titled Chinese Musicians. It was made by a porcelain manufacturer in England, and I really became interested in this topic of chinoiserie. In some ways, for the opposite reasons that Adrienne was pointing out, I think with the blackamoor figures and ornamental Blackness, it's this kind of, they're very visible and highly charged figures. But with chinoiserie in the 18th century, which is the period that I'm interested in, it's this kind of sudden eruption of these figures that you see them everywhere, and they don't even register really as kind of figures, but it's a kind of style of ornamentation. It's a taste, it's the object, it's the place. So many of these different issues are sort of swirling around in the 18th century, but they particularly accrue to the material of porcelain. And I was kind of interested in kind of teasing out some of those issues, and the question of, how do you think and talk and write about race before it's been mapped onto this kind of ethnographic and anthropological framework. And the decorative arts plays such a huge role in that, which is why I was very much interested in joining the conversation today. But I won't go any further. I could talk probably all evening, and I'll hand over the baton to Sequoia.
Good evening, everyone. Hello, Iris. Hello, Adrienne. So great to be here, and thanks for inviting me to join you all. And hello to BGC community. Great to be back in for an evening. So my work is centered on ceramics, actually. I have a sustained interest in this particular medium, and I generally work in 20th century material. At the Gardiner Museum, where I work, we have historical and contemporary collections internationally from various areas. And I've started to think actually really mostly about the 18th century and the 20th and the 21st century. And so I'm interested in some of these kind of continuities, some of these long stories about how ceramics can embody some of these ideas about racial types, racial stereotypes, and how these questions sort of fit into the larger frameworks. So the objects that we're looking at here are mostly 20th and 21st century, actually. And the reason I wanted to include them as a sort of an intro is to point toward how some of the depictions that we're seeing both in the 18th century and in the 19th century material kind of carry forward into the 20th century. So some folks in the room will be familiar with Clarice Cliff, an early 20th century English designer, widely celebrated as a woman designer from the interwar period for her, her many successful forms and surfaces. And the piece here was made by Clarice Cliff Studio for the Canadian market, and you can see that there are pretty clearly racist depictions of Indigenous Canadian folks. There's a way of sort of presenting these kind of geographical and figural images of a particular place as a way of kind of defining that place, and also creating this kind of jumble of people and images that are both specific and completely generalized. So some of the tropes that we see in Majolica and the 18th century really get carried forward into these novelty ceramics in the early 20th century, which then become part of the sort of vast ceramic trove that artists in the contemporary context are drawing from. So we have two examples of those here that I've been thinking about. One is a piece by a Francophone Canadian artist named Leopold Phillips that is in the Gardiner collection, like the Clarice Cliff piece. That's a contemporary Blackmore candelabrum is the title of this. And you can see that in this piece, Philem is really pulling from a handful of stereotypes as a way to, to do, I'm not quite sure what, but I think for it involves sort of humor and irreverence, but clearly is pulling from racist tropes and stereotypes. I'll also flag that in the same way Clarice Cliff is celebrated as a pioneering woman designer, Leopold Philem is celebrated as a pioneering queer artist who really brought the language of queer aesthetics into ceramics and into contemporary ceramics. But his ways of thinking about race and depictions of race are perhaps a bit different. Finally, I added this image here from a project presented by Theaster Gates, an American artist who's having a show in the UK right now. And thanks, Iris, for flagging this image. It's fantastic as an installation image of this exhibition of Theaster Gates, which you can see includes some historical ceramics from late 19th and early 20th century, kind of in the family of the Greetings from Canada teapot. They're these sort of stereotypical depictions. And one thing that's amazing about Theaster Gates's work is that he's really reframing them and recontextualizing them and pushing against some of these tropes. You can see in this image in the lower right, there's a jar by David Drake, Dave the Potter, Dave, a well-known 19th century enslaved African-American potter. So there are, a number of ways of approaching these. So I think I'll leave it there for the moment and hand the baton back to Adrienne.
Oh, well, thank you. And I don't even want to go on. I just want to ask one question about Leopold Philem, because we will be looking at the Majolica Moors, who are jardiniere here, but they were also done as candelabra as well. And do you think that Leopold is critiquing that tradition, or is he? Do you think he's critiquing that tradition?
In a word, I'd say no. I feel like at the time that he made this, I would imagine that he was coming from a place of irreverence and a place of camp, actually. Quite a bit of Leopold Philem's work is within camp aesthetics and within camp and kitsch discourse. He frequently will repurpose figurines and molds and kind of novelty ceramics and reframe them as sort of queer vignettes and queer scenarios. in this case, I think that there is a queer reading of this where the red lips or lipstick as well as being a racialized depiction. I think he's playing also off of the kind of Black Pete figure in Northern European kind of Christmas and holiday traditions. I should also add that he works with found forms quite a bit. So the metal piece of this would be something that he would have found, and probably the Santa figure was something that he found in like a thrift shop and then made a mold off of and recast it. So I don't see him working in a racially critical mode.
That's interesting. Okay. Well, I'm going to look at that for my book, so we'll talk about that later. So now we're going to start looking at what are some of the ideas that we feel laid the groundwork for much of what we see in the 19th century Majolica sort of phantasmagoria. Iris, you had some thoughts on this?
Sure. So, building on what Adrienne just said, I think it's really important to contextualize Majolica in a longer history of ceramics, but specifically porcelain being the most distinguished type of ceramics in Europe. And the place where you're really going to see race as a kind of factor in the reading of the objects is in the context of these four continents figures. So what you're looking at here is a set from Fulda, a German manufactory, and you have America, Europe, Africa, and Asia depicted in the form of female allegories or sort of personifications. Of course, the world is not divided into just four continents. We know it's a much bigger, more complicated and messier type of place. But this really set the kind of stage for thinking about the world and the kind of the different races that existed in the kind of 18th century imaginary. And I think on the one hand, it creates a kind of framework for thinking about race in a kind of ideational, allegorical, and abstract way. But by the 19th century, because we still see it showing up, and Adrienne, I know you'll talk about this a bit more, it also becomes a kind of screen for masking or disguising much more sort of violent and clearly racist depictions of people as well.
Yes, and it's interesting to think about the four continents being in a Baroque and Rococo sort of formulation of how we divide up the world, how we see races, how we, and in terms of my interest in Blackness, how Blackness is depicted often under the sort of umbrella of the four of the continents. When there is, like you said, a very violent, a very exploitative sort of relationship between Europe and certainly European powers in the 18th century, France, England, and Spain, of course, before that, and Africa in the New World. And even the America, the allegory of America and the allegory of Africa are so intellectualized, right? And pared down to certain kinds of attributes that totally mask or not, they don't even address really any of that, except for perhaps Africa being a sort of a cornucopia, a place that provides riches and wealth, natural wealth to the rest of the world. And in some ways you can say that does kind of speak to what's being extracted from Africa in terms of the human capital. So it's an interesting, like you said, the way that this changes so dramatically, but I think it still kind of informs what we see coming up in Majolica. Do you have anything to add, Sequoia, about this?
No, I think that's good. I think maybe the only other thing to say would be just the sort of the depth and variety of these depictions of the four continents, that they're really kind of working out a visual system for what these sort of places can mean in the as we're saying, in the European imaginary.
Mm-hmm. And then it all heck breaks loose. Oh, okay.
And
So yes.
And I just wanted to add too, so porcelain, obviously we use it for vessels, like utilitarian things and whatnot. But I think there's something too about the fact that they're figures that really distinguishes this four continents theme, that we see the world depicted in people And you can move to the next slide, but I do think the body as the kind of bearer of that meaning, I think, is pretty important.
Yes,
And
and yeah, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
They speak to sculpture. I mean,
Yeah.
they're in the realm of miniature sculpture, as opposed to maybe a sugar bowl or some other kind of utilitarian thing, where we find here with the Majolica often is utilitarian, but certainly not always. And of course, these are, in my estimation, some of the most fascinating and objects that I've really ever seen in Majolica, and very important to my study of ornamental blackness. They are spectacular objects. They're over 6 feet tall, created by Minton. And they were displayed, they're actually jardiniere. So on the top, they would be holding plants. And they would be located in your home in the uh, conservatory or orangery or winter garden. They're not really meant for an outside garden. And they are, and of course, these are spaces where they were intended to go. They're spaces where you display exotic plants, really, from all over the colonial world. And I really like the way Joe Briggs, one of the curators or contributors to this exhibition, points out in her essay in Majolica Mania that the tropical environment kind of gave the idea of sort of excess and extremity and difference. And we see that, and I feel like these figures would have played right into that notion of the sort of tropicality, excess, and even a little bit of naughtiness. And they're based on bronzes by the French artist Carrier-Belleuse. So there's a actual artist linked to these, as opposed to some kind of generic forms. And these were really meant to be like tour de force. There are several pairs of them. I don't know exactly how many there are. Maybe someone in the audience does. And but they're not mass produced. I mean, they really were very, very special. But they are also, as opposed to, in addition to being really interesting and kind of spectacular, they are part of the long tradition of the Blackamoor in decorative arts. And that carries with it a lot of weight. But before we go and look at those comparisons to this long tradition, I just wanted to talk about the figures themselves. Could they be allegories? We certainly look at this figure on the right, the male, who has a head of a lion skin, quiver and bow. These are all straight out of Ripa's Iconologia, and they are what we would always expect to have with the allegory of Africa. And so, but that is a reference. And then, of course, for the woman, she is really not an allegory. She's more kind of, in my estimation, straight out of the kind of Orientalist influence, with the feathered fan and the striped headdress. And certainly by this time, European artists, Carrier-Belleuse is French, and Orientalism is one of the major sort of tropes of exoticism. And the Black females are harem dwellers, are prime figures in many Orientalist depictions. So that's where I see her, what kind of reference I see her. So I don't see this as a four continents even pair, even though there is reference to that. So you're already getting the kind of eclecticism that we find in Majolica. But
well, Adrienne,
yeah.
if I can add on to
Yeah.
your really great analysis, I think what's so, to me, when we spoke about this earlier, what's so striking is the bases of the figures, these incredibly sexualized, satyr type figures, so that you're reading these two bodies within a kind of sexualized economy, totally fits into that kind of orientalizing discourse. And I think also the pairing of the male and female breaks them out of that four continents model a little bit, so they read in a different way. And of course, the two last things is the color of the Majolica and also the scale.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's astonishing. And actually, the print that they were based off of is a Baroque print. a French Baroque print that had, that was a design for a guéridon that would have been maybe produced at Versailles, even though I don't know if it was ever really produced there because it was for silver and they melted it all down, but it had the satyrs. So this is a very much a Baroque conceit. And so that's why it's definitively linked to this Baroque design, which I didn't put in here. But I do have other images that I think. So where does this tradition that of the blackamoor, who is actually a servant, who is a glorified sort of celebrating service, celebrating Black servitude and these are in very important collections. Where does that end? And the Majolica in the 1860s begin. How can we separate this? Or in my estimation, I feel like it's all of a piece. Sequoia?
Yeah, I would agree. I think that there is this continuity and sort of a through line in a way. And in the same way that the kind of blackamoor figure in the center sort of reaches back toward the four continents, which had, become such a pervasive idiom that you can kind of point toward it without actually sort of fully articulating it. You can have the attributes, even though it's not part of sort of the formal system. That then becomes sort of this, Iris used this great phrase of economy, a sort of economy of imagery where there can be this continuity. And I feel also like there's something about labor and leisure that's happening with these works where, there's a kind of potential for labor, the laboring body, but also a sort of leisure, a kind of at rest body, or that sort of surplus of economy that you could be that these figures could be standing, and there could be a sort of potency in the possibility of further labor. Way of depicting wealth. Maybe.
Well, it's almost like the laboring has become sexualized in a way, in the sense that it's placed in this kind of subordinate position that I think is incredibly problematic, but also clearly that's where it derives a lot of its visual force.
It's interesting that I've been looking at these blackamoors for so long, I almost don't even see it. But when you really think about an object like the piece on the left that is now in the Villa La Pietra, who they have, I want to say 50 pairs, let's say, of blackamoor, maybe less, but they have a very large collection of blackamoor figures there, and they were very nice enough to allow me to come and be part of an important project that they had in reconsidering these. But so many of them are nude men with shiny bodies. And to think that have a nude slave with a shiny body, stand decorating your home. And whereas if they do kind of mimic and parallel the actual lived experiences or the bodies of actual servants in the households beginning in the Baroque era, this is where they come out of, in my estimation, sort of a objectification of the kind of liveried servant. But so many of them are in these, are nude and kind of sexualized in that way. And there's the sort of issue of shine. We know that there was a tendency to shine slaves' bodies with oil when selling them on the block. Now, it might be that might be too far afield to go with this. Certainly, it's too far afield to go with the Minton piece, but it's kind of a signification that I would parallel, not trying to prove intention necessarily in these. But what's also interesting is that these read as slaves. Even this 18th century blackamoor sundials, lead sundial, could be read as a four continent, certainly was part of the iconography of the time, but that from the very beginning they were called African slaves or slave sundials, because there were no, in this form, there were no other corresponding continents. And it was the most popular lead sundial. I mean, the most popular lead garden sculpture of the 18th century was the blackamoor, whether it's a sundial or a planter. that's another situation altogether. So you've got this language that is being spoken about these. So that's why it's very, when you find something really interesting and eclectic like this, that from Carrier-Belleuse in the 19th century, he's trading on these racialized, not just tropes, they're conventions. Right, this is a conventional figure. The female, the conventional, she's a conventional figure, the exotic female, a harem attendant or harem dweller, and the kind of Africa slash, whatever, I don't even know what to call him, but and some people look at him as a king. So I mean, there are a lot of ways of interpreting him. But as they hold, if you think about them in your conservatory holding plants, then it becomes a different kind of a thing. Now, I thought we would just for a minute think about, are we being fair? Maybe we're not being fair. Because we have other objects, wonderful objects like these fountains in the Royal Dairy that have a similar kind of aesthetic, drawing on the Baroque, in this case, kind of grotesquerie figures, mythological figures that are carrying fountains, they're carrying pieces, they're certainly white mythological figures. So what is the difference? Am I just going too far afield?
If I can jump in, I think
Yeah.
one thing that sort of sticks out is the question of scale.
Mhm.
And the fact that these figures are 6 feet tall, right? And it's interesting, you start to read the registers of these figures across. So if you're going to look at the sort of cornice, the column, and the plinth or the base, you notice that the section of the animal that's holding up the shell is kind of roughly the equivalent of the figure here. So there is a kind of, subordination again, I think that's happening, even though, like you said, these are sculptures, they're works of art, but they're still they're still holding and laboring. Whereas maybe I'm reading too much into this, these kind of mythological creatures are housed in these shells, right? The shells, which are the basins where the water sort of falls and catches and kind of glistens. So I read them, I read these figures at the register of the animal, which I think is, it's a subliminal thing, but I think it's maybe there.
Hmm.
I think that's a really good point, Iris. And I feel like there's not one of the, I don't know, maybe risks is that there are no really stable readings of these figures in a sense. And so I think if we are looking at them and looking at them critically, I think we have to be open to the possibilities of the overlaps of these readings, that something that can be racialized in a context, in one context, can be maybe deracialized in another context, and that these meanings are in fact unstable.
And replaceable. I mean, this whole commodity, right? The sort of 19th century commodity culture where you can replace one thing with another because it's so easy. You're so good at making glazes and ceramic forms at gargantuan scales. Everything is replaceable and expendable.
Right. It's interesting to me. I feel like you cannot wrestle the Black body from the legacies of slavery in Europe, whether it's France or England in the 19th century, even after abolition. It's very hard to break those connections. Um, it's just too soon, and there's been too much. But again, these are exoticized figures, and that exotic context it often becomes a lot of smoke and mirrors, really, so we don't have to focus, or we don't end up focusing on that really troubling and that continues to be a fraught relationship, right? Because there is a certain fetishization, I can never say that word, about Blackness. We know that their images and paintings and sculptures of Black people, particularly for the French, and some of them are actually spectacularly beautiful and sumptuous. I'm sure many of you have seen the exhibition Le Modèle Noir that was in the Musée d'Orsay, and so compelling. But there's always an interesting twist and facet to it, when you really start thinking about these situations. And I don't think we have answers for any of this, but I think it's really interesting to talk about it. And then, of course, I had to bring this in. Um, yes, this is an contemporary interior of an 18th century home. Maybe it's a 19th century home, but it is, there's certainly an 18th century portrait there, but there you see the two ceramic figures here with plants on their heads. So these are descendants, straight line descendants from our Minton Moors and I wanted to bring them in to see how they might operate in this kind of a theater of design. And especially when it comes to something like the portrait, right? You were talking about the portrait, Iris, and the other ceramics there on
Yeah, no, I mean, it's again, if we're talking about kind of, registers,
Mhm.
right? The kind of seeing the two equestrian figures sitting on top of the dresser and then the figure up high in his full kind of, suit. And the obscured faces of the jardiniere. It really, you suddenly realize how these objects are meant to work in a setting is very different from how we see them today in a kind of exhibition setting. So it's certainly something to think about.
They're
Yeah.
part of, yeah, a set. It's almost like like the theater of fashionable and sumptuous living. There's no question that all of these are, especially big showstoppers like the Moors, they would have been part of a larger array of ideas and images. And I want to move forward, so just thought should throw that in. And just briefly again, still staying in the garden, we have these pieces are so, beautifully executed. But I've been thinking about these exotic types that are used as garden seats. And there's quite a bit of difference between the two, even though they're both kind of exoticized and they both kind of speak to the kind of interest in Orientalism, and certainly the Egyptomania that is kind of gripping Europe during the 19th century. But the violence that I feel is being kind of bestowed on these young boys, their their bodies are you're literally sitting on top of them. It's something that I can't, it often gives me pause.
Yeah, that's Adrienne, if I can sort of respond to that. I think one thing that's so challenging is what you were talking about, the sort of technical finish
Mhm.
and the kind of real perfection in terms of technicality, and yet the total disregard or just I don't even know what it is. Like, I mean, how do you even approach an object like that? And, how do you even talk about it in a way? I think it's something difficult. Sorry, Sequoia, I cut you off.
No, not at all. I think, yeah, I've just to, I guess, reiterate, there's such careful attention and such a sort of willing kind of disregard or sort of absence of broader thought. And I think maybe the other thing that I would bring into the conversation about these two is around the sort of the understanding or the way of thinking about Egyptomania or Egyptian imagery, and kind of making the separation that was being made at the time between sort of North African and Sub-Saharan African, and the idea of kind of extracting from the notion of Egyptian culture the Nubian aspect and the Nubian dynasties, and really making Egyptian culture a sort of a North African phenomenon that's less connected to blackness, it's like specifically non-black.
But again, working into this system of colonialism where you divide and conquer,
Yeah,
right? You divide the sort of subjugated peoples into different racial categories, a hierarchy of who is better than who based on this skin epidermal schema that is totally made up. I mean, this is a classic sort of colonial imperial method of conquering. So, definitely that's at play. And again, like that sort of weirdly attentive sort of the attention to the glaze colors, and again, the kind of disregard of the semantics of what this is doing is interesting.
Mhm. Well, I will say that that I feel like the interest in North Africa, this Orientalism that I've been talking about, does account for sub-Saharan Blackness there, but most of the time the sub-Saharan Blacks that you see in Orientalist imagery are servants, are the ones who are. So that's therefore we have the Black slave girl holding up the chair in a more dignified way. But I guess if you sit on it, then your rear end is right at her face. I'm sorry, being silly, but I mean these are kinds of like look what would Mimi Hellman say about how you interact? How does the body interact with this object? I mean, it creates meaning. And so we'll find in Orientalist art a lot of Black children or servants or eunuchs or so I feel like they're kind of speaking to that aspect as well. And we are not running out of time, but we're moving along slowly. But I think these are really great conversations. I wanted to talk a little bit about the issue of commodities, colonial commodities, and how these figures turn up in the serving receptacles, and how those receptacles um, bring in this issue of race and labor in ways that you wonder, just like you were saying, is it a lack of consciousness? Is it a conscious disregard? Um, I mean, about the connections that tobacco and the history of tobacco and the history of tobacco coming to England via the work of slaves in Virginia for the most part, at some point in the late 17th and 18th century. And the black body was used to advertise. I mean, there's a close link between blacks, and not just any black person, but a black slave, naked or in a tobacco skirt, is used to advertise tobacco from the 17th century onward. And we're talking about 1870s and 80s, and these figures are more whimsical. Here's our whimsy coming
Yeah.
in.
Adrienne, there was something that you said earlier that I thought was really spot on, this notion of a racial phantasmagoria,
Mhm.
right? So that even though, on the left, we're talking about an object made way after, well, actually not way after, but hopefully, I mean, after the sort of age of emancipation, and yet there is this kind of constant, the sort of specter of re-enslavement and containment, and it's done under the guise of whimsy, like you're saying. It's this kind of commodity, this curious commodity that makes it an acceptable place to do that. For example, you would never make a marble sculpture out of the tobacco jar on the left.
Mhm.
But I don't know, Sequoia, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I love the idea of that specter of containment, because obviously we have a container here, and the way that the container sort of stands in for the body, or like this kind of headless figure at the top, or the head at the top, who's a bodiless figure, and the commodity replacing the body, I think really speaks to the system, Iris, that you were pointing to of dividing and conquering and then selling. Is sort of the third step is to actually make it consumable, to turn these different sort of segments or segregations into saleable entities that could then circulate globally, obviously.
And the heads on the side are very interesting, like mascarons almost, but they do have I think maybe I'm interpreting that as another lion. So there you have the reference to
For
Africa.
continents, yeah, it's that continuity. If you get just that little kind of like nod to this lineage of depiction, of
Right.
racialized depiction.
But then
Yes.
the kind of monstrous feet at the bottom, I think,
Yeah.
again, speaking to that kind of, um, monstrous quality that's always involved, the subhuman
Mhm.
denigration.
Um, So I'm going to move on because I'm going to just briefly say this and then move on because I saw this piece in the catalog and it was not identified. It just says figure group. It's very interesting, the piece on the right, but I'm looking at the date. I'm looking at, and the first thing I thought was, oh, run, Eliza, run. This has got to be a scene from Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is the second most popular book in England of the 19th century, besides the Bible, and perhaps this is an abolition. There's an abolitionist sentiment here. I mean, abolition has taken place already. And perhaps there's a nostalgia for the Old South, there were lots of different depictions of characters from Uncle Tom's Cabin. We find in porcelain and ceramics all throughout. So I think that maybe we should look at that as something way to identify this piece. Whoever is in charge, please look. And then before we leave the Majolica world, I thought I would bring in some sort of second tier pieces because I mean everything in the show is from the best manufactories, and I appreciate that. And I don't want to sully that with these kind of unknown continental porcelains, but I do see that these tropes of Blackness continue to become popular, and then this whole genre of objects that are nostalgia for the Old South. Looking back, this is post-Reconstruction. This was very prevalent in American culture, a way of romanticizing slavery, and it becomes a very big theme in Majolica. And that reminded you of this piece, this print, didn't it, Sequoia?
Yeah, it did, absolutely. And I mean, we have these kind of, whatever, late 19th, probably early 20th century kind of novelty figures that are drawing very clearly from, or I think clearly from this, from an 18th century, an image from the 1760s of a certain type. So, of course, not the specific image necessarily, but the trope of the enslaved Black African, in this case, a Mungo character from a play from the 1760s depicted, with a basket and kind of moving this basket. And it sort of fits into this visual language that I think carries through the 19th century and then into the ways of thinking about how to depict these characters in the early 20th century, again, in this kind of novelty, kind of lower bar context.
Yes. So I think we need to switch up a little bit, and we're going to go on a little bit longer. I think we'll go to a little bit longer at 6:55 with our discussion. About the British fascination with Asian types, right? It has a long history, right, Iris?
Yes. So again, sort of building on what I said at the start of the talk, I think with chinoiserie themes, it's this kind of strange, both the familiarity in the sense that it has such a long life in the British context, for example, and yet it's a long familiarity that is predicated upon a foreignness and an unknowableness, right? This kind of a projection and a fantasization of the East that is unknowable. So it doesn't matter if we're really talking about India or Japan or China or Southeast Asia. They all are kind of blended into this fantasy of Cathay. And yet, on the other hand, and we discussed this earlier, this intense fascination and focus with getting the details right. For example, the sort of the tea tray with the hair, the bun sticks in her hair, and the details of her costume. So all the kind of focalization on the ornamental and the kind of superficial qualities are key to this sort of Chinese taste that really reaches a fever pitch in the 18th century. If you want to go forward. And so, the question is then what kind of visual work is chinoiserie doing in the 19th century? So, in a work like this, it's unclear if we're really dealing with, chinoiserie as it's coming from the 18th century, or if we're dealing more with the sort of fascination with Japan after it, quote, opens up to the West after Commodore Perry initiates trade relations with Meiji Japan. But again, it still retains that kind of projection, a fantasy of this unknowable world, and a real interest in the ornamentation and the kind of superficial aspects, rather than a kind of interest in individual people, or even figures, I think.
Uh, Now, what's
Right.
interesting to me is
Awful. Sorry. But I'm sorry, Andrea. But Iris, I think you totally hit it right at the end there with where it's like the people and the place are just sort of operating at exactly the same register.
Yeah.
And like it doesn't, it's like they don't function as people. They don't even
Yeah.
function as characters or caricatures. They're like, it's all this attention to ornament, as you're
Yeah.
saying. It's like,
It's just a part of a kind of pattern, a sort of superficial pattern and I mean, beautiful, really
yeah.
beautiful, detailed, and just, the kind of attention to, this is a really fantastic piece, the sort of attention to the tree branches and the pine needles and the flower kind of going over it. And so there's a real kind of fascination and a real desire to create forms like this. But of course, we're not really talking about a there, right? We're not talking about the sort of mapping of a people or a person. It's a fantasy.
Mhm. Absolutely, and I think that's what it's meant to be, right? So, and is it a vase? I would like to know if this is a vase. I see an empty space here. I just
I
want to see what it might be, how it might be
it,
operating in
it
my home.
looks like it could be for sure on the end and kind of creates that sort of asymmetry, kind of Ikebana vibe.
Right,
And I think
right.
the other thing that I'm wondering about is whether, and this is more of a technical question, like whether the figures are cast separately, right?
Mm,
Because if you think about fabricating this, it's obviously made in a mold that's then been finished by hand, and it's hard to imagine that the figures were part of the same mold. And so in a way, they have to be like intentionally inserted. And so you could have well, now that I'm looking at, like, I'm wondering if the seated figure's head is connected to the branch,
Oh,
right?
I see a message from Earl Martin saying it was probably a flower holder.
Yeah.
So we're all wrong.
Thank you, Earl.
We
I
have
thought it
all
was
Thanks,
been
a
Eric.
vase.
proven wrong.
Anyway, so
Yeah,
that notion of like adding the figures versus the figures being integral, I think, is a curious question with this one.
Yeah.
and this kind of reminds me of the little Japanese ceramic pieces that you can buy to put in your plant. Like, you know what I mean? The little, yeah, you
Al-
can buy them and
I
like
don't
put
know.
in a terrarium.
All the plants I buy die. So
Oh,
Maybe you need little figurines in them,
yeah,
yes, maybe.
I know. Um, but what's interesting to me here is the incorporation, the beautiful and sweeping incorporation of nature, like you said, in figures, um, and and the way they are all sort of as one. But what kind of bothers me is the fact that it's called Japanese boatman. Now that could have been anyone's designation, right? But there's a female character here.
But again, so
So boatman.
interestingly, in contrast, I think, to the blackamoor sort of trope, where
Mhm.
the figures are hypersexualized, right? There's a kind of emasculation and even a sort of desexing, I think, of figures in chinoiserie that's very interesting.
Oh, yes.
I don't know if you want to move forward. I
Yeah,
don't
yeah,
remember.
I guess we have to go because, well, we don't have to go now. We're just gonna stay till all night. But no, this was, oh, I'm sorry, I have my note to myself. Omit? No, we didn't omit it. Um, the Chinese dignitary in a boat. Now I brought this in because I thought, wow, I didn't even know what we would say about it, but I thought that Iris had a really interesting point about the longevity of these ideas and the sort of malleability, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, it's a sort of a long familiarity with this imagined unfamiliarity, if that makes sense, and kind of integral. And I think Qimeng Yang, her wonderful scholarship on chinoiserie and performing China speaks to this, where the construction of British identity in the 18th century is predicated upon, right, the sort of construction of the other as both a mirror, but also a kind of a means to differentiate British culture in a way. So, it's a very long-standing fascination, I think, that's in particular in the British context, I think it's there for a
Mhm.
while.
And it was, I think that it's important to think of these as vignettes, because this is one of 11 panels, and they would all have a different vignette, likely chinoiserie at that point. But 1696, that's 17th century. That's interesting. But to reduce these different cultures to vignettes is one way of sort of making them sort of again focusing on the whimsical aspect of one little scene. Um, and that's what we see coming out in a lot of these Majolica pieces. Even if it's not even a whole scene, even one piece of Majolica can be its own vignette with so many different things going on um, at the same time. Speaking of a vignette, I thought this was a really interesting comparison. And of course, now we have the commodity of tobacco, but here's tea. And this Holcroft teapot is really beautifully done. And then I brought in some others that are sort of derived from that, but not quite up to the same quality, but clearly drawing on this design. And so these are how the things continue to unfold and unfold in different spaces. So so Sequoia, you thought it would be interesting to show these in contradistinction to this piece, this Canadian piece.
Yeah, I did. And I think that, you know, one thing that stands out is this idea that Iris flagged of a kind of fantasy of Cathay, the sort of hybridization of different images and the tension between the specificity and then the generality, the sort of overlap. And one of the aspects of this is the same Cliff teapot in the Gardiner collection that I highlighted earlier, is if we look at the handle, it looks like, you know, a mask of some kind, maybe like a kind of Polynesian or Tahitian or sort of Pacific kind of iconography that's sort of grafted on to a kind of Plains Indian iconography that's grafted onto a kind of woodlands, you know, moose. And so it's that kind of, you know, that sort of hybridizing fantasy that you can kind of mash these symbols together, and it sort of evokes something around these kind of, you know, infantilized or kind of childlike figures on these sort of full and kind of round fruit forms that you were speaking to, Iris.
Yeah, I mean, I do find this teapot very cute. You know, and again, it's a sort of weird ambiguity between like you covet this object, right, for its cuteness, and there's a whole theory of cuteness and you know, the zany and the cute, and I think a lot of that you can see in many of the Majolica pieces. But again, there's something in the back of your mind that's also saying something isn't quite right, and you know, it there is a kind of a sort of rumble of dissonance, or you know, and I wonder even in the 19th century if that was the case as well. But yeah, I mean, there's an operation being done to the body, so it has to sort of hold on to this fruit figure, fruit form. And of course, this is a longer trope that you have in the 18th century too, but you kind of wonder what's happening at the end of the 19th century.
We have gone on, and it's almost 7, so I think we're going to take questions and answers now. Should we? We'll stop sharing, and if I need to, I'll bring the screen back up. But
Great. I'm going to jump in here and do a little bit of moderating. I think we have time for a couple questions. We might not get to everyone, so we apologize, but I hope the richness of this conversation is enough to sustain you in the absence of your question being answered. There's a lot of questions I'm seeing on the Q&A around what's the origin story of some of the Blackamoor figures that you showed at the beginning, Adrienne. Were they made as a commission? If they weren't mass produced, like what's the decision there on like, this is being made because somebody wants it?
well, these were designed based on a pair of bronzes by Carrier-Belleuse that were shown in the 1862 London exhibition. And then Carrier-Belleuse also designed for Minton. And so he derived from those bronzes, they were bronze torchère, so they held up candelabra, I think, these blackamoor figures as Gardiner for the 1865. And I think they were done as like a big, Minton would have created a sort of a tour de force showstopper um, for their display there, So I think that after that, they did get orders for more. But I don't know whether the pair exactly that we were looking at was the first pair that was created and shown. It was reproduced in the illustrated journals, etc., and discussed as a major contribution by Minton. And then the subsequent pairs would have probably been ordered because that would have been how people would have, had to invest in something like that. But
Right.
there were several pairs created.
Anyone else want to weigh in? Well, I think we'll move on to the next question. Um, there's a question about sort of like, I think we've been speculating about this. As I'm hearing you talk about the intention, I think there's not a lot of evidence to support like what the intention behind some of these figures that have this very dark tension living inside of them. But the question is like, is there any evidence? Is there anything sort of sources to speculate on the intention behind certain pieces or not?
Well, I would say that the blackamoor pieces, a lot of them are anonymously created. But so I look at it as why are these things fashionable? And the fashionability, and then the endless repeatability of it, and the way they show up in different spaces. Some of the earlier blackamoors from the 18th century are recreated for homes of big estates of people who are involved in the trade. So they're literally trophies of empire. There's trophies of slavery. I mean, so you could put them in the context of who owns them and maybe they commission them, maybe they get them, but then they just become fashionable. So intention is not what I'm trying to show. I'm trying to show the way they operate.
Right.
It's very hard to show intention.
I
Yeah.
think that's such an important point, and thank you, Adrienne, for making it and for doing the work too, because I think that if we rely on sort of text-based documentation of intention, then that really limits us. And this is really, I think, part of the work of material culture studies, tech arts history, and art history more broadly, is to uncover how they operate.
Great, thank you. Another question here around the glaze. So I'm going to just read it in full. So firstly, what a great conversation. Important attention to race and ceramics. I wonder if the panelists find the racialized porcelains more, less, brackets, or differently disturbing than the Majolica figures due to the different color palettes and glaze techniques / medium, i.e. translucence, difference between how the sheens read. The Majolicas strike this person as more grotesque through the prevalence of primary color, the big greens, yellows, reds, for example.
Yeah, I do have, if I can sort of jump in on this question, I do have to say there's something about both the technical mastery of I mean, Majolica is known for its hyper brilliant colors. And, initially the idea was to kind of imitate the Renaissance Majolica palette, but they far surpassed that in the kind of range of tones and the consistency of the glazes. But I have to say that there is a sort of registration of an epidermal hierarchy. And you can definitely see that with the two blackamoor figures you showed, Adrienne, where the fawns that are sitting at the bottom, they're not white, right? They're not in that kind of Della Robbia palette of like the fruits are colored, but the figures are white because you want to imitate this kind of porcelain, purity palette, whatever. They're painted in this kind of strange flesh tone, which makes them become alive and look like they're sort of living beings. And if they're alive, then what's the meaning of painting those figures in that incredibly dark, really saturated pigment? What are you trying to signal by the contrast like that? I don't know, Adrienne, if you wanted to add on to that.
I've never thought of that signaling anything by the contrast. So I'll have to think about that. But I do know that the different iterations, the different versions that have of that pair sometimes have different tops, and they're painted differently. The clothes are different colors and the skin color is different. And I think that might just be an accident of who is in charge of painting these objects at the time, and pigments. In terms of this being more saturated, and because there are other figures that have a different color brown. But what has always bothered me, I mean, I think that there's an attempt to make a natural brown more so than was in the 19th century, where the figures were just black. The Meissen figures are just, and no one has just like the figures are pure white, they were pure black. And so this, again, just sort of a conceptual notion. But I'll have to think about that.
Great. Oh, go ahead.
No.
Sorry. A question here about asking to sort of talk more about whimsy, the cultural function of whimsy. This person comments that particularly in the garden seats, they see some of these pieces, a racism that invites the person who uses the object to enact a kind of performance of whiteness that really does depend on a kind of violence or sadism. So sort of unpacking whimsy a little bit more for us.
Well, I always think that whimsy is almost like decorative, even though we know that it's not the same, but it operates in some interesting ways in that it alleviates any kind of culpability for these ideas that we're talking about, violence, racism. I don't even like to use the word racism because it's a simplified word. But there are so many different ways to describe what's happening. You don't even have to say this is a racist object. So whimsy takes us off the hook, like the Sequoia was saying, the figures, the little figurines with the basket. They're totally whimsical, but there's a very specific agenda going on there to whitewash slavery through the lightheartedness of it and the way that the decorative is seen to be benign.
I would add, thanks for that, Adrienne. I would add also there's something to my thinking about the possibility of ownership, the sort of containability of whimsy or of like a garden seat, that this is something that you can surround and encompass and control, really. So the whimsy sort of lightens it within this kind of division, sort of consumer approach as well.
And entertaining, it's supposed to be entertaining, I think. And
Yeah.
they are entertaining and charming.
I'm thinking also too, Adrienne, with that Leopold Villon piece about kitsch and camp and sort of how whimsy kind of is adjacent to kitsch and camp. And camp is obviously such a complex sort of set of maneuvers, but there is an aspect of it that really covers some tricky territory and can give shelter in the same way that whimsy can.
Mm-hmm.
I think I have one more question, and then I think we're going to close for the evening. But again, thank you for a great panel stated in this question. Interested to hear more about reception and markets. Was the market for Orientalist ceramics the same in France as in Britain? Did events like the 1865 rebellion in Jamaica affect the way in which objects like the Minton Jardinier were received?
I think that's a good question, and I cannot answer it.
It's a question for the catalog authors. Right?
Yes.
It is.
But again, just to speak to Adrienne's excellent choice of title for the panel, right? We're talking about the Majolica imaginary. So I don't think it's a matter of a kind of cause and effect where you can say, there was a pointed response to this, and this was the outcome or the result. Just like you can't say, there are sort of specific reasons or an intentionality, right, for an object. I think we're definitely interested more in kind of mapping an imaginary where that certainly would have been on the minds of, the people living in England at the time, and aware of the colonies and their dependence on the colonies, living in the British Empire. But at the same time, it's not going to show up and register visually and pinpointedly in the ceramics, but it's certainly there, I think, hovering at the margins for sure.
I think one thing that's so fascinating is how, the Civil War just like blows through this whole kind of project of Majolica, and like we cannot be aware, like we cannot see that. We can kind of pass through the whole project without seeing that. And so it's really curious.
Well, any final questions, thoughts, or comments from our amazing panelists, Adrienne, Iris, Sequoia, any final
I just want to
words?
thank everyone for coming and listening. And we have lots of interesting ideas that we're just beginning to flesh out about this. And we appreciate your indulgence, really.
And I would say, you know, this is recorded, and then we're hoping that to work with Adrienne a little bit to figure out how some of the ideas discussed in this conversation could be put on our web exhibition website. So to sort of represent this visually and textually as an imprint of an event on the website as well. But thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sequoia. Thank you, Iris. Thank you, Shirley from Pro Bono ASL, for joining us as well.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care and be well. Thank you so much.
Bye.